Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Publics IIHS, which is our monthly talk series where we bring you conversations on the Urban Arc, which is IHS's annual research conference, completes 10 years in January. And as part of our anniversary celebrations, we are bringing back some of our past Urban Arc presenters for talks to either revisit their work or present new work. Our speaker today is Marina Joseph, Associate Director at Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. She's been a part of UrbNAG before in 2020 and 2023, and we're really happy to have her back present some of her new work. This session today is being moderated by Antara Rai Chaudhary, who's consultant here at IHS. I will hand it over to Antara to introduce Marina and begin the session. But a quick announcement before that applications for UrbNAG 2026 close tomorrow. So if you're interested in applying, please do so by the end of the day tomorrow. Over to you, Antara.
Thank you, Tanvi, and to the team behind IHS Publics for setting the stage and getting us underway this evening. Thanks to all of you who have joined us for the next hour and a half on this Wednesday evening to be part of this discussion and share in the conversation on this topic of how to recognize domestic work as a sector of occupation as any other occupation. I think engaging with the domestic work and efforts to transform what it means to live and work as domestic workers is crucial because it's not just a site that reveals inequality and how it shows up, but it's also a site where it is reproduced and normalized every single day in the way our lives are organized. And it feels unfair, and yet somehow it comes to be seen as natural and even inevitable and unimaginable. So I guess it is for this reason that these large scale surveys on the working and living conditions of domestic workers, no matter how many you have, become a very important tool. They help make visibilize how this occupation as it exists today is shaped by systematic inequalities. They underline, they remind us, and they prove that these are not accidents of history or neutral outcomes of the market. What we observe is a long standing policy choice that continues to structure both opportunity and exclusion in society as well as these lives. Uh, and on this note, I'd like to invite Marina, a speaker for the publics today, to share the findings and her reflections from a recent survey of about 5,000 domestic workers from across 15 districts in Maharashtra. This is conducted by YUVA, which is short for Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. And it was done in collaboration with a network of worker organizations called Maharashtra Rajya Gharelu Kamgar Samanvay Samiti. And I invite her to speak from her also personal and collective experience with YUVA and the network that have been working to transform governance in this sector for a long time. And I think it's extremely interesting and important for two reasons. Uh, One, it adds to the legacy of such studies, but it also speaks from not just the metropolitan, but a lot of small towns that are often not part of these kind of statistics. And secondly, it also tells us experience of what it means to have a welfare board, which is dedicated for domestic workers. And thus, we can learn a lot about what we want to ask when we call for a welfare board as a tool for facilitating social protection at the national scale. I think there's a lot to learn from the experience and the survey that Marina will share. For those of you who may not know Marina, she's an associate director at YUVA. She has been engaging with issues of urbanization, labor, and habitat for the last 15 years. Her work focuses on promoting equity in the urban, strengthening grassroots leadership, and advocating for social justice in the city. She holds a degree in community organization and development practice from TISS Mumbai. Over to you, Marina.
Thank you so much, Antara, and thank you to the IHS team for this invite. And it's really a privilege, I think, to have this conversation with you, Antara, because we had also gone through the IHS ILO study on domestic workers and on employers. So it's great that you're facilitating it. Okay. All right. Um, so just to start with, my presentation today will draw from three different aspects. One is the report that the links to which I'm sure will be shared on the chat, which was the situational analysis of domestic workers in 15 districts that we did the data collection for this in 2024. and we published the report earlier this year. Based on this report, Siddharth Joshi and myself, we are in the process of publishing an article which looks at this data and also makes a case for a unique legislation around domestic work in particular. And then, of course, drawing from our practice, YUVA's work with domestic workers, the work with the network, Maharashtra Rajya Gharelu Kamgar Samanvay Samiti. My presentation will be a mix of what data has shown us and what practice is also speaking to. To begin with, just in terms of definitions, defining domestic work isn't easy. There have been debates on domestic work as being part of care work, and that's largely how ILO has seen it, because often care work, that is the nurturing of children, elderly people, and domestic work, which is largely household work, cooking, cleaning, etc. These have been seen as separate, but under the ILO conceptual framework, this broadly, both care work and domestic work is seen as care work in general. The IHS study, in fact, in the Indian context, used the term housework as an overarching category involving both care and domestic services. But very interestingly, I think what that study showed is that there are both paid and unpaid categories of housework. And that's very important to acknowledge, because women in all households bear the brunt of this. So the IHS ILO study in the Indian context said paid housework equals domestic work. So it's fair enough to say that domestic work in India can be circumscribed to two factors. One is the nature of the task, that you're doing household work. And the second is the place of work, which is generally considered to be the confines of the house. But this actually comes with certain shortfalls, because it then takes away domestic workers who probably work in office settings, cooking, cleaning there, gardeners who work in the periphery of the house, uh, people who do household work, but their work is not tied to the house. It involves the outer, um, the outside the house as well. So in that context, the ILO convention, which is the Convention for Domestic Workers, which was passed in 2011, mentioned that domestic work is work performed either in or for a household or household. So it doesn't look at the confine of the household as being a criteria to define domestic work. And I'll come to why this is critical, especially when we look at the data. We look at estimates of domestic work at the country level. Further, of course, there are types of domestic work, and there are, of course, full-time workers, part-time workers. Full-time largely is 8 hours or more. Part-time is anything less than that. And live-in residential workers and live-out workers can be full-time or part-time. In terms of what data shows, there is actually no comprehensive data on the number of domestic workers in India. So what is shown in the table here is just based on secondary analysis. What it does show is that even when data does exist, owing to definition challenges that I mentioned earlier of who really is a domestic worker and what work constitutes domestic work, the data isn't fully accurate. So if you look at the eShram data here, and we know eShram is self-reporting, you're self-declaring yourself as a kind of worker. The eShram portal, as of December 2023, showed that there were 2.8 crore domestic workers in India. But the categories under which you can report yourself even include, hotel workers. They include people working in different kinds of kitchens. They include workers working in pantries of trains, etc. So the definition of the household then is completely broad when we are looking at the way domestic work data has been captured at the central level and at the state level by the eShram portal. Then if we look at the periodic labor force data, and this estimate has been done by my colleague Siddharth, looking at how domestic work has tripled in between 2017 to 2024. And it really shows us a trend about how domestic work as a form of employment is significantly increasing, not just in urban India, but in rural India as well. But again, in the PLFS data, when this analysis was done, there were particular kinds of codes that were used, but we tried to use the employer's dwelling unit as the location of the workplace, which the eShram data doesn't do. So again, while I present this data saying that there are maybe around 1.75 or maybe 2.83 crore domestic workers in India, Owing to these definition challenges of the nature of the workplace and who constitutes a domestic worker, we are not able to fully gather this. This is apart from the fact that no comprehensive survey of domestic workers has been done at a national level. So, what really is the specificity of domestic work? And here there are three particular issues that one can bring to the forefront. One is that domestic work, unlike many forms of informal sector wage work, domestic work is very clear. The employment relationship is clear, it's regular. But what happens here is that the relationship is one to one. There is your employer's, a single employer. And most of existing labor legislation looks at a certain threshold number of workers being employed. And we can take the example of the Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act, which actually clearly mentions domestic workers as a group that should, be able to access this act. But what it does in the fine writing of this act is that to put in place an internal complaints committee, you need to have at least 10 workers within that establishment. And because the relationship is one to one and the employment is such, this act doesn't actually benefit domestic workers. What it does say then is that they can, if a case does exist and they can approach the local committee. The local committee will then forward it to a police station, which is anyway a provision that exists for women. You don't need a law to say that you need to that you can access the police station. So in a sense, this act, while progressive and includes a number of women workers, for domestic workers per se, this act is it doesn't really hold any significance in that sense. The second part, or the second aspect of why domestic work is specific and unlike other casual wage work is that while it's carried out at a definable workplace, the workplace is private. The workplace is the household. And again, labor legislations mostly look at factories, establishments, industries, and of course, the household is none of this. So, how can domestic work be legislated vis-a-vis other labor law? And the third aspect is because a large number of domestic workers, and even in our study, we saw a large proportion of them were part-time workers. Part-time workers have more than one employer. So, in fact, the highest percentage of part-time workers were working in up to 2 to 3 homes. Of course, there were many who were working in more homes than that. But it just goes to show that when you have multiple employers, it is easy for each employer to not take onus for any form of social protection or minimum wages, because it becomes the responsibility of many people and not just one. So, just to elucidate on this point of minimum wages, uh, because, like I mentioned, there are so many employers. Most states have actually adopted this approach of fixing task-specific or hourly or daily minimum wages for domestic work. So there are 11 states that have notified domestic work as a form of work in their scheduled employment in the Minimum Wage Act. And they've also given a task, a per hour or a task-based approach to it. But what actually happens is the actual wages earned are a combination of the number of houses engaged in and the wages negotiated with each of them. But even then, there is a possibility that while maybe one employer is meeting the minimum wage standards for that particular task or for that particular hour, on at a daily basis, it is very likely that the domestic worker is earning much lesser than minimum wage, and that's actually what our data also shows us, that domestic workers are earning much lower than minimum wages set at the state level. But of course, because of this multiplicity of employer-employee relationships, there are a lot of laws that are then not applicable to domestic workers. So that was the aspect on the specificity. And just also to talk about, I mean, I didn't want to ignore this bit on a new form of domestic work that is emerging. So while in the context of definitional issues that I mentioned earlier, especially at the practical level of enumerating who a domestic worker is and what sets them apart, like I mentioned earlier, about what sets domestic workers apart from all other informal sector wage workers, is this emerging form of domestic workers within the gig economy. And these actually threw up newer challenges on issues of domestic workers' rights, because in terms of payments, grievances, etc. And our study also had a small sample of women using a platform for work. While we didn't go into the details of it, I think, and I also don't want to comment because we have not engaged with this group much. But it's important to say that this sector will significantly change the way domestic work is seen and the way domestic work is practiced, especially because in the domestic work sector, it's the employer that holds power. But in the gig economy, the employer no longer has a face. So, what does it mean when domestic workers are paid much less than minimum wage, but it's the platform that is then being the employer in that case. So this is also an aspect that neither has is data really speaking to, or definitionally also this is going to throw up a whole new set of challenges to understanding domestic work. So I'll come to the survey. So a little bit about why the survey was done. So there is a lot of work done by the collective, the MRGKSS collective, through organizations. These are different organizations working across the state of Maharashtra, different independent activists, different unions. And a lot of their work is to ensure the functioning of the Domestic Workers Welfare Board in Maharashtra, ensuring access to social protection, securing the rights of women. But I think the reason to doing this, the reason and the understanding behind doing the study was to really say that it's not enough to just say domestic workers live in poverty. Really understand the implications of this data. Why are these women poor? What do income levels look like? Because at a neighborhood level, one might know that this is a going rate for a domestic worker, but at a state level or at a district level, what does that really mean? What are income levels even like for domestic work? Also, what are the intersecting vulnerabilities they face? And look at them definitely as workers, but very importantly as women and as citizens, what rights do they have vis-a-vis the state? And yeah, so in that sense, these recommendations that came out of the study are to the Labor Department in Maharashtra, definitely, but also look at the Social Justice Department. They also look at recommendations for municipal corporations across the state. So the idea really was to use data to show trends that can be acted on at the level of practice and also for advocacy. In terms of objectives, we were looking at working conditions, we were looking at social economic conditions and access to social protection. So a little bit about the sample. I'll just quickly show you all what the sample looked like. So these were the 15 districts that through the network we were able to reach out to, and honestly, it was because of a network that that a study this big is even possible, or it's done with such accuracy. So there were around 5,000 plus workers. The data set that we finally used was around 5,019. We had 95% of them are from urban areas, and 5% were from rural. Also, not to say that domestic work is emerging in rural India, it has always been there. It's just that in terms of welfare and protection, the urban workers have somehow always been much more at the forefront of negotiations and conversations. And yeah, also in terms of the sampling, we tried to ensure that there was a proportion, that the share of each district in the urban subsample roughly coincided with the share of the urban population at the district level. So if you can see, like Mumbai city, Mumbai suburban districts, Thane, etc. These are large districts in Maharashtra, and we try to ensure that the sample was adequately represented across. So, yeah, this is the final report, and based on the report, there's also a policy brief that was published, and that's also been translated into Marathi, and a lot of advocacy with local elected representatives, bureaucrats, etc., is still ongoing. So, coming to the survey findings, I mean, it's not maybe some of this data, especially in terms of gender, while we are saying that 99% of the women that we surveyed were women. Some of the caste data, in fact, is a little telling. So we found that 48% of the women belong to scheduled caste communities, 13% belong to scheduled tribe communities. And why this data is really significant is that women belonging to these communities were overrepresented, because if you compare this to the proportion of their population at the state level in Maharashtra, the proportion of those belonging to scheduled caste groups is actually 11.8% at the state level. But in our sample among women domestic workers, they were 48%. In terms of the ST data at the state level, they are around 10%, but in our sample, again, they were higher, more higher, highly represented. This is also based on the 2011 census, so there will be a few ups and downs, but by and large, the trend is pretty much the same. But one important thing is that there were rural and urban differences seen. One is in terms of the fact that there were more number of scheduled tribe and OBC women hired in rural areas. This is also pointing to the more prevalence of caste discrimination, etc., in rural areas. So there is that rural-urban difference we see in terms of hiring women domestic workers. Importantly, and this is something that we didn't really expect, is that majority of them are actually from within Maharashtra itself. 65% lived in their own homes, 31% were living on rent. 40% were actually single earning members of their homes. At least a quarter of the data that we had showed that the women were from vulnerable economic situations, either widowed, divorced, abandoned. And in terms of entry barriers, education levels were awfully low. So 33% never attended school, 50%, 20% just up to a lower primary level. So almost majority of them, and even after that, the ones at the secondary level, it's safe to say that education levels are, extremely low. And because of this, there is the likelihood to take to domestic work is much higher. But I want to take this data forward and use this to look at what does intergenerational and intragenerational mobility really look like, because the data showing that there is very low mobility out of domestic work. So 94% of the domestic workers, the largest proportion have mentioned that they have worked as a domestic worker for 20 to 30 years, and a majority, 36% of them are within the 35 to 55 age group. Just going to show that it's likely that women begin domestic work, between the age of 15 to 20 and are likely to continue. And old age really seems like the only way out of domestic work, because when we asked about skill training or alternative sources of income, they were very low, 5% and 2.6%. But one point that we want to make here is this really about children. As practitioners, I think the question for us is the understanding that legislation around domestic work or any issue might take a lifetime of work of a domestic worker. But what does this mean in the interim? What does it mean for their children? What does it mean for the next generation? Are they also going to be forced into domestic work? And keeping this in mind, we had collected this data asking from the point of view that can there be interventions focused on children of domestic workers? Is there need for childcare arrangements, etc.? And which is why when we asked this, we also found that a high telling percentage of children of domestic workers had dropped out of school, and 1% was not even enrolled. And when we asked about where children are kept while women go to work, the highest percentage mentioned that older children are likely to take care of their younger ones. And this itself points to the fact that if older children are expected to be taking care of younger children, what are the implications of this on their ability to attend school? And of course, it is mostly younger girls who end up bearing the brunt of this childcare work even at a young age. But in terms of mobility, then do they then end up, entering the same workforce? In terms of our socioeconomic and workplace conditions, so like I mentioned earlier, the largest percentage of our sample were part-time domestic workers, followed by full-time. These are all live-out workers. The sample that we were able to reach out to, and this is also a challenge of organizing, whether it is unions, etc. The likelihood of being able to organize part-time live-out workers is much higher, whether part-time or full-time, because they are generally organized at their places of stay or at their places of work. But live-in workers really don't have that option of being organized. There are some initiatives, especially with around placement agencies, etc. But it's fair to say that our sample is also skewed towards live-out workers for this reason. In terms of monthly incomes, now there was high disparity inter-district disparity and as well as within each district for the kind of work, whether it is for sweeping, swabbing, dishes, etc. There was a huge differences were seen. But by and large, on an average, the state level income for a domestic worker is around 8,900 rupees. But if you look at, and I will show you this slide here, really points to the intra-district differences. So you can see districts like Mumbai, Thane, Pune, which is basically the cities of Navi Mumbai, Panvel, Pune, Bombay, where domestic workers are at least able to earn more than 10,000 rupees a month. But majority of the districts actually have domestic workers earning less than 6,000. And in Satara and Latur, there were two districts where we find that domestic workers are earning even less than 5,000 rupees a month. And this is far below the state minimum wage. In this context, it's not surprising that the workers who were interviewed, 1/3 of them mentioned they are unable to meet household expenses and they end up relying on debt or, savings are almost nil, but they end up relying on debt through various means. In terms of how they are paid, mostly continue to be paid in cash. Only 1% reported having a contract, and these were workers, like I mentioned earlier, either who worked through an app or worked in an office setting. So they are likely to have contracts there. In terms of bonus, this was actually quite telling that only 30% of domestic workers receive annual bonuses. Majorly during Diwali, some also mentioned that it's at the discretion of employers. But how much are even this 30% who get an annual bonus? How much are they really getting? Only 28% of this lot of domestic workers get 1 month salary. 34% received half month salary, and the rest were completely dependent on whatever the employer wished to give. But there's a lot of, if we link this to domestic workers relying on debt, relying on advances from their employers, uh, when we ask what else do you receive, this thing of getting clothes, food, salary advances, etc. Somehow, the APU has done a lot of study around this as well, looking at how the relationship of the employer and employee sorts of, in a way, keeps domestic workers from negotiating for bonuses, for annual increments, etc., because of the sort of paternalistic relationship shared between the employer and the employee. Yeah, sorry. Okay. In terms of periodic increment in wages, there were just 14% that reported the same. And among them, 22% of these workers said that they didn't have to ask for it, that it happened automatically. The rest all mentioned having to ask for an increase in wages. In terms of number of holidays, the most common practice was to have a fixed number, which is actually 2 days of leave a month. Just 4.9% of them mentioned having a fixed weekly off, which is actually basic as per many labor laws. And 31% mentioned that they were taking leave as and when needed. A lot of discrimination and harassment was also reported. In terms of what kind of discrimination, the most common form of untouchability that was reported by workers was the use of separate utensils, not being allowed into the prayer room, not being allowed to use the bathroom at all, not being allowed to use the kitchen, or not being allowed inside the kitchen or prayer hall during their periods. So this was in terms of what the workplace looks like for a domestic worker and the implications of this on their socioeconomic conditions. So the third objective of our survey, like I mentioned earlier, was looking at access to social protection. What does the state provide for domestic workers? And broadly, there are two forms of social protection. One is general social protection, measures that cover a wide range of informal workers, not necessarily targeted to one particular group. So under that, when we looked at the access to the public distribution system, a good number, 68%, have access to a ration card, even though among them there were many concerns of inability to access these rations. In terms of pensions, because we do know that a chunk of these women are either widowed, abandoned, senior citizens, etc. Very few of them, just 12% of them, are able to access pension schemes that the state offers. And there are other studies that we have done looking at barriers to access and what really needs to be done to make social protection much more accessible. Only 10% covered by health insurance. And like I mentioned earlier, the eShram portal, which is a self-registering portal for informal workers, only 31% of the workers who we spoke to have even registered themselves on it. The second form of social protection, and I think that's really of interest to many people, is the Maharashtra Domestic Welfare Board, because Maharashtra is one of the only three states other than Kerala and Tamil Nadu that have a welfare board. So there is a Maharashtra Domestic Workers Welfare Board Act that came out in 2008. The welfare board itself came into force in 2011. And the welfare board, interestingly, the act mentioned that there are two roles for this welfare for the act. One is constitution of multiple boards for the promotion of welfare, and the second is to create funds for granting various financial benefits. And I'm highlighting this point here just to show why neither of this has happened over the last more than a decade. I'll come back to this. So this is what the data looks like in terms of registration. So the figure on top is looking at the number of registrations that have happened in the welfare board and the number of renewals. So the thing with registration in the welfare board is that it has to be renewed annually. Very poor registration also because there are almost no schemes in the board. And if you look at the analysis again done by my colleague Siddharth, is that when you look at the state government budget outlay over in the corresponding years, you will actually see that in the years where there has been a budget, there has been registration because maybe there have been a scheme, there has been some sort of a one-time transfer that has been done. But because of the fact that there is actually no budget outlay for the department, for the board, the registration numbers, there is no way to convince domestic workers regarding the benefits of this board. So I'll come back. Our survey found that 57% had registered with the welfare board. Also keep in mind that this was done through a network of domestic worker organizations and unions who work specifically on ensuring women are registered, recognized within this board. So this number is definitely on the higher side because of the nature of the sample and the nature in which workers were accessed. But even among them, 91% have mentioned that they have not accessed any welfare scheme under the board. So what are really the issues issues with the welfare board? And this is also important because of the latest Karnataka government bill on domestic workers in Karnataka, which again, has suggested setting up of a welfare board. There are many lessons to learn from what Maharashtra has and hasn't been able to do. Two issues. One is in terms of structure. The act mentions that there has to be a tripartite board, a representative from the employer side, a representative of unions, as well as someone from the state. But this has not been the case. It is actually a one-member board. In terms of also structure at the district level, there are all these different districts have various ways in which registration happens. It's different, done by different officials. In some places, it's the BOCW officials that are taking double charge of this. Many of them aren't even aware of the fact that this is a responsibility that they have. So in the study, there is a qualitative case that has been written of how at different districts in Latur, Jalna, and Nagpur, how these district level boards are really not functioning and why it's not functioning and what unions and organizations are being able to do to even hold systems to account. But importantly is that these are all at the district level. For a domestic worker to spend multiple trips going to the district office is also not an option. There are no taluka or ward level access points for registration. So these are issues in the structure of the board. While I think the act mentions that it has to be decentralized, in terms of practice, this has not happened. In terms of functioning, like I mentioned, it is heavily dependent on the state government, unlike the BOCW, the Building and Other Construction Workers Act, which has a cess act alongside it. In the absence of a cess act or in the absence of an imagination of what other sources of funding can be, the board is actually unable to operate meaningfully or even come up with adequate schemes that can incentivize workers in a sense to be part of the board. Okay, So in terms of okay, before that, I think I should make this point here is that I think what Maharashtra, the experience really shows is that for a welfare board to function effectively, it needs to have reliable sources of funding which can operate meaningfully. And secondly, it should provide for an easy and accessible registration system, in the absence of which there is large scale exclusion, even though the act is well meaning. And, I think there are significant pressure groups as well. But what really needs to be done for a board to function effectively is looking at sources of funding and accessible registration for women workers. So, why this research gains significance is there have actually been 17 bills dealing with domestic workers that have been tabled in Parliament, but none of them have been enacted. This between 1959 and 2017, KJ Sophie has done this analysis, and she's referred to this as something called legislative lethargy, which it is. And why has this not happened? We can go into that in the discussion. I don't think one has to look very far to see why that has also not happened. But the study gained significance because this year, in fact, in January 2005, there was 2025, there was a case of a live-in domestic worker who had been very horribly abused by her employer, and that case was taken to the Supreme Court. And as far as an outcome of the verdict, the Supreme Court issued directions for the constitution of a committee, saying that a committee has to be set up within 6 months to look at whether a legal framework can be recommended for the benefit, protection, and regulation of domestic workers. Very interestingly, at a time when most of our labor laws have been made, have been sort of been sorry, I'm not getting the word. The four labor codes have sort of overridden most of labor legislation in India. At a time like this, Karnataka, and just last month, in fact, released the draft bill for domestic work and is calling for suggestions, and that process is ongoing. We have also submitted some suggestions to it. So in the sudden push to legislate around domestic work, what our data does is really making a case for a unique sectoral legislation, because existing legislations, like we have mentioned earlier, it's not possible to just extend these generic legislations, and neither are the four new labor codes even responding to domestic work. Unfortunately, they're responding to gig workers, who are a new and emerging form of work, but they're not responding to domestic work. So we're able to use this data, use these facts to highlight what makes domestic work so peculiar, so specific, and why we need recognition for this workforce of women, really. So this is what we've been able to do through the research. A lot of advocacy. These are images from the launch of the study. It was women from across the districts had come. There were around 2,000 women who came for the launch of the study. It was widely covered in the press across districts in different mediums. There were, I think, at least 25 different media houses that have covered this. So there is, and it's important to get to build pressure in different forms. And these are not just forms of building pressure on the state, but also on employers. I think having articles put out on domestic work in newspapers is as important for employers, and I'll come to that ahead. So really, what does the road ahead look like? Two aspects, and in both the policy brief and the report, we have legislative as well as non-legislative policy measures detailed out, and in terms of what needs to be done. So in terms of comprehensive legislation, definitely needs to recognize minimum wages. It needs to incorporate registration of employers. It's not just the registration of domestic workers that is important. We need to have social protection guarantees, including extending maternity benefits to women domestic workers. Can building bylaws have the integration of childcare facilities, rest facilities for domestic workers and large residential complexes? Occupational health, this is also an aspect that is completely ignored in domestic work, because occupational health and safety is seen as something to be worried about in factories and in factories and large establishments. But there are significant occupational health and safety risks of working in households as well. So to really bring back that conversation to domestic work legislation. Very importantly, regulation of placement agencies, platform based work as modes of hiring, and have talk about uh, not just social protection, but also the rights through which grievance redressal and accessible grievance redressal becomes part of the legislation. In terms of the non-legislative policy measures, because the study was focused on Maharashtra and very much advocating to revive and rejuvenate the welfare board, of course, there's a big chunk of talking about what needs to be done there. But can we also look at integrated social protection access? Or can different schemes be integrated to ensure women domestic workers don't have to go to 10 different departments or to 10 different places to even access rations, to access healthcare, etc., etc., etc.? Can there be like a one-stop shop for social protection for not just domestic workers, but for vulnerable workers in general? Skill development, pensions, and there's actually so much more. Uh, and I think it's important to mention that many unions, many different unions, organizations across the country are doing a lot of work, and there's a lot to learn from their methods and their strategies. The Seva model in Kerala, for example, has been very successful in integrating the unions um, into the welfare board there. But I think the point, there are many examples, and the point that I want to make here is that, and I also want to conclude with this thought actually, that with regards to domestic work, the role of employers is as critical in this conversation. While, yes, holding the state to account is absolutely essential, the role of employers vis-a-vis domestic work and having their buy-in is almost as critical as the role of the state. So to outreach to domestic workers, and one thing that we've been thinking, and our team has done, is to actually they've developed reels based on these trends in the data and the trends that we've been seeing in practice itself. Because really, maybe reaching out to employers, reels is the easiest way. So these are some of the reels. I won't be able to show them, but I would encourage you to maybe follow our Instagram channels on which you can see these reels, and really talking about some of the realities domestic workers face. And it's about, the access to the whole life cycle approach. Do they have access to maternity leave in the formal sector? Do you have access to old age pensions? What happens to women after they reach a certain age in domestic work? Access to bathrooms. In fact, that has got the highest number of views, and are domestic workers even allowed to use toilets? And when they're not allowed to use toilets, what mechanisms are they left with? So I'll end with that. Thank you so much. These are our social media pages. There's the MRGKSS website has actually been recently launched, so please check it out. There is a section that talks about the role of employers and the role of if any domestic worker wants to register in the Maharashtra Welfare Board, what can be done. So request you all to maybe check out the reels later, and I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina, for that. This is such a valuable piece of documentation, I think, and empirical knowledge on so many aspects. And the report has a lot more for those of you who haven't read it before. I think this just covered maybe 50% of what's there in the report in much more depth. Um, I'm not sure if it's already the data set is in the public domain or if you plan to put it in the public domain. But think if it's accessible, more of us can engage with it and draw out patterns that are maybe invisible right now. And it also, I think, gives the data a much longer public life. Otherwise, a lot of time and work that goes into it. And it's something that we've also tried to do it and haven't been able to do it.
Okay.
I think it gives it a much more uh, public life. Um,
Mhm.
I think I'll come to the
Yeah, I
question.
think the only point with making these data sets public is really issues of privacy of domestic workers, because it does have the details in it. But yeah, maybe we can have a conversation on how that can be done, keeping in mind you know, privacy
It can be
concerns.
anonymized and we can
Yeah.
connect. I think after listening to this and especially reading it your report earlier, I had a couple of thoughts. Maybe I'll share a response first, pick some question and answers, and then come back again towards the end. I think what stands out it is in the absence of a national representative data on domestic workers. There are actually a lot of these studies that happen across India. So there are studies in Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, Jaipur, Bombay. There may be more that I don't know of or I'm missing right now. And I think what's interesting is that the patterns around the education, the profile of like education, caste composition, rental housing, and it sort of becoming a last resort or a safety net for women who are divorced or separated is very universal. So it's sort of, I think there is a pattern emerging, even if they are not representative in the statistical way, or they are not done with that intention. I think there's a pattern that has come off, which is quite useful to start thinking of a policy which is more informed and also yet catches the nuances that I think uh, that there is a large population in this which is also educated, and there might be possibilities of mobility for some. That rental housing is also a domestic worker issue, and that it can't be looked separately because it affects what your earning actually means when you have rental housing versus you have your own house. And I think something we say very similarly in our data, which I saw in yours also, that the registration when it comes to identity, an Aadhaar or a PAN or a voter ID is very high, but registration when it comes to entitlements is very low. And I think that's a pattern again we see across these studies. That's something to think about. I'll pick a few questions and then maybe come back to some other responses. Um, we had Mohini ask if you have a the monthly income, is it weighted against the number of hours spent, as that might also differ across regions, and is there an hourly wage calculation? Also, what do you think are the possible reasons for inter-district difference in incomes?
So, I mean, I don't know if this question is directed towards the monthly incomes in general for domestic workers or our study, but
The study,
there
I
is
think.
actually okay. But in general, like just to also add that because with 11 states having notified minimum wages for domestic workers, it is weighted against both. It's weighted against the number of hours spent as well as the kind of tasks done. So in fact, there's a, I think in 2018, there's a study we had published analyzing all of this, and maybe I can put it in the chat, where we've looked at which states have what minimum wages, hourly, etc. Yeah, we did not. We asked in terms of what work they do and how much they paid for that particular job. We did not ask about the number of hours. In terms of what are the differences for the inter-district differences, I think wages are completely about dependent on negotiation and this absurd neighborhood rate, that prevalent neighborhood rate. So
Mhm.
one is, in like places like certain localities in urban areas like Bombay, New Bombay, Panvel, Pune, etc. The going rate will be something. It will somehow over a couple of years increase. So it's really based on negotiation. In some places, I must say, unions are doing a good job of fixing like a wage rate card. So that is one like a positive way in which wages can be standardized. But the reason for this is really about negotiation between the employer and employee and some understanding that this is the going rate. So there's actually no one reason I can respond to. I don't know, Antara, based on your understanding, you all have also done that study. So
Yes. Um, I'll, Janvi has a question on the welfare board, where she asks, what is the future of the domestic workers welfare board now that you see the e-shram portal being introduced and the introduction of the new labor codes? Is there a sense that how e-shram is going to be, or if the welfare board is now less active than before? What is-
I mean, no news on the Ishram so far and what it will do for domestic workers. And it's been now what 5 4 5 years since the Ishram portal has been launched. So specifically for domestic workers, nothing. In terms of the labor codes, again, the code on social security just expands what was earlier there for informal workers, which includes informal workers in general. It doesn't particularly offer anything for domestic workers, though it introduces something for gig workers. So with the introduction of labor codes, nothing has really changed for domestic work in terms of social protection, if that's what you're asking with regards to Ishra.
Another question from Janvi was, do you see that the international instruments like the ILO Convention on domestic workers, does it help the domestic workers struggle on the ground, or when they are talking to the employers, maybe in your reels, does it give a sense of legitimacy in practice?
So definitely, I mean, no doubt that the ILO Convention 189 that was passed in 2011 has been significant. Many countries have then ratified the convention. They also have laws that have been passed for domestic work because of the ILO Convention. So yeah, I think in general at a global level they have helped workers and workers movements. And also, I think at a national level, even within India, using the ILO conventions and what has been offered for domestic work is a very useful negotiating point at the local level as well as at the national level. So I think no doubt in the benefit of such conventions. Although it happened very late, in our opinion, 2011 is quite late to have finally recognized it at a global level as well, to recognize domestic work globally.
Hmm. There are a few more questions I'll come back to. I was also thinking that you also mentioned that there have been so many times that legislations, bills, policies have been tried at the national scale and even at subnational scale in different places. And we know that they have often been stalled or silenced for several reasons. And even the experience with minimum wage notification or the social welfare board has been very uneven despite being around for a long time. And in many cases, often the minimum wage notification actually ends up doing more harm than good, because the wages that are being set are actually less than what people are maybe earning in totality. So and when they do work, and I think which is the case even in this report, we see they work better when there's a union or a collective that is present to mediate and ensure that there is an uptake, that workers are aware and they're able to follow up and get their entitlements. But unionization in this sector is very limited, and it is not possible to unionize 100% in this sector. And while many of them also do exceptional work, it cannot be the medium of implementation, because the mandate of a workers collective is very different. And if they start picking up this work, then that work is sort of neglected. So now that, again, like this year, after the January announcement, like people have been trying to come together, and the Karnataka the bill is already also in place. How do you, like, do you think the outcome this time will be any different, and what could workers unions or academics, or like what could people do differently for this time for the outcome to be different, that it's not again that we send in national policies and there are bills, but they are again either stalled or silenced? What do you have
Yeah,
any like
I mean,
discussions in your life?
this could be like a personal opinion, and if I can share that, while not too hopeful for a national legislation, just given the fact that India has decided to have its four labor codes to be, what labor is then legislated around. So while there might be central guidelines on how domestic work can be approached and what can be some minimum standards to be followed, I think Karnataka is showing the way in terms of this being legislated at the state level, legislated sectorally. um, so yeah, and what can be done differently? I feel definitely unique legislations at sectoral legislations at the state level, and a lot more of employer push. I feel it's also putting the burden of this on domestic workers and unions is not enough. I think employers, I think today in urban India, I think your study only showed that even households earning up to 3 lakhs annual income, they're also employing domestic workers. So I think if employers can also, in some way or the other, be engaged on this matter, there is definitely scope for some change this time, if that's possible. I think employer engagement is critical. And I think that's a piece that has been missed so far in the conversation on legislation.
On that, so if I think and speak from our work at IHS, of the study of employers that we did in 2021, and what we think is like, for any kind of employment related social security scheme, or as you say, for this to take shape, there has to be some buy-in, and there also has to be a clear employer-employee relationship. But what we see is that the households that employ domestic workers don't identify themselves as employers, or those working in those homes as workers. So it's very difficult to establish that responsibility, and there's no sense of oneself as an employer. And on the questions of registration, uh, they're simply opposed because they fear it will lead to a certain kind of surveillance of their
Yeah.
household uh, practices, and also some just not wanting another sort of like burdensome activity. But what you say is absolutely important. I think one is to one is to see the employers also as a site of study and understand what is going on in terms of practices, but also like what kind of like systemic pressures they are responding to, or what kind of cultural practices have they normalized, and then have more interactions with them. Which brings me also like to some of the questions that have been asked about, how did you go about creating some of this advocacy material around reels, and how have they played out on the ground? Like, do you see a difference, or do you see like any kind of engagement on it online?
Yeah, lots of engagement on it. In fact, they're the most watched reels that we have ever put out. So I think there's definitely some uptick in terms of maybe people just watching it, sharing it, feeling like this issue something that we are witness to, we are party to as well. So I think there's definitely online engagement on the reels has been high. In terms of how we went around making these reels, so we have a team that did the scripting, etc. Our own internal team did the scripting, and we have like like who do street theater in general, who came on board to do the acting, and there's some of my colleagues itself who have acted in those reels. So yeah, it was an internal production completely, if I have to say.
um I think that's most of the questions that we have from the audience, and also for me, I guess. uh, I think something that, again, we're thinking aloud is that, because we're thinking about employers again, and how this bill will come into place, and how the social protection uh, actually will be operationalized, as you said, depends on the source of funding, and for the registration to be actually accessible, and for it to be universal. But I think there's a dilemma that, the employers are ready to be registered as employers, but they want to be assured that this is not a surveillance mechanism, but it's only a way for them to be registered so they can contribute their welfare fee, which is something the Karnataka legislation talks about. But the legislation also talks about minimum wages, and then would a registration only be a mechanism for social protection, and then there will be different modes of monitoring whether the minimum wage is being applied or not? And if we have to choose between one or the other, that either minimum wages are implemented well, which might mean there is employer antagonism, or we might just go with the social protection, social security, welfare board, so that kind of a path, where there is a higher probability of working with employers, and also like who is to who should be the one who decides which way this goes. Do you have any?
Uh, I mean, One is, yeah, definitely a lot of awareness on that. In fact, even within Maharashtra, registering a domestic worker within the welfare board in involves getting a letter from your employee, from your employer saying that the domestic worker is employed by me. And that itself encounters significant challenges because there is suspicion as to why a worker wants, any letter signed from the employer. But yeah, we have noticed that if there is someone to do that negotiation, maybe, someone from an organization, a union, to speak to that employer to just assure them that this is the purpose for which this is being used, those fears are completely allayed. So I think, yeah, there needs to be some uh, integration of unions and collectives into the process, and it's possible. And nowadays nothing is too difficult in terms of social media access. Everyone has access to phones. There are many ways in which employers can their fears can be allayed if they have fears at all. Because I mean, if they're willing to put themselves on urban clap and hire a domestic worker for 49 rupees an hour, you have all your data on that app, right, as an employer. So I think there are ways in which it can be worked around. There are some questions here. I don't know if you want to take it.
Uh,
Antara, do you want to or no?
yes, I think I missed this from. I think there's a question about why you chose Maharashtra as a field, and within that, the districts that were chosen.
So, like I mentioned, this is, I mean, YUVA has had historic work on with domestic workers in Maharashtra, so it was like a natural choice. Though we have worked with domestic workers in Assam as well. But yeah, one is we have existing work, the network exists. The network has a presence in multiple districts across the state. So I think it was like a natural choice regarding the field of study.
And I think a follow-up question is if there are if you see that there are different struggles or demands of domestic workers or these collective across different districts.
Yeah, there are definitely, especially, poorer districts, etc. I think just their access to the welfare board is much different. They're, in terms of discrimination, very different in terms of the travel time, etc. It is different. While common issues exist, there are inter-district differences, and I think our report has many more details on this.
Are there any differences between rural and urban sites? Although I know there are not a lot of rural respondents that in your study, but
Yeah.
still, yet.
No, there definitely were, especially in terms of the kind of untouchability seen uh, among domestic work in rural areas was definitely high. And so that becomes part of their struggle as well.
Uh, there's a question.
And also, I also want to make a point here. It's much more difficult for rural domestic workers to prove that they're domestic workers within the welfare board. That's also there.
Why is that? If you could clarify.
One is in terms of employers, domestic work in rural areas has a very different sort of understanding. Very often, there are generational issues, etc. So it's not as easy to get like an employer to sign off saying that I'm working as a domestic worker here. Like it's much more entrenched, I think, the issues of labor.
And there's a question from Janvi on data. How do you think the data of domestic workers can be improved at the national level?
I mean, I think we can start by it needs to be collected, but no, I mean that's a very basic answer. I think what really needs to be done is definitionally, if there can be clarity on who constitutes a domestic worker and their place of work. I think that national level data can significantly improve because right now, like I mentioned in my first few slides, one is who a domestic worker is and what work they do is not clear. And secondly, is their place of work is not clear either. It's understood to be the household, but what about domestic workers who do work for the household outside of it? So yeah, if definitionally issues are clear, that can be a way to improve the data. So,
And there's a commented question from Nidhi. She says, "Thanks for sharing all these insights." And if the survey instrument that you developed was available, and how you developed it, and if it was available on public domain.
yeah. So it is as an annex to our report, the survey instrument has been hyperlinked. It's accessible. How it was developed based on experience. So the team developed it, and then we had a couple of rounds with the MRGKSS group as well to clarify whether these questions made sense, if other things needed to be added, if they were, irrelevant, what other data can be collected that would be relevant and meaningful for them to use. Yeah, it was done in collaboration with them.
I also saw the instrument is available online, and it's been developed on the online tool. So right now it's shared as a PDF, but I think it could also just be a very useful open source public resource. Since on Kobo you can also share your survey as a public tool with institutional citation. So if there are other people who are thinking of doing similar surveys with large networks with some sort of like customization, it could sort of initiate a lot of this kind of data, and then there'll be a comparable data because it's the same question, same tool.
Mm.
That's something that
Yeah,
could help the
that's very
student
important.
travel to other states
Correct.
really.
Right.
Good. We have a question from Manvi. Do collectives, unions plan to use the findings of this study at the local level to negotiate for better implementation of the legal provisions of the Act?
Yeah. No, they are using it already. So the study was published in April.
Mhm.
And yeah, they have used it at the local level. They have had their own, different districts have sort of, some districts have published this in the media. They are using the state level, especially the domestic workers welfare board data to ask for better services at the district level, etc. So yeah, I think they are using it, and the hope is that it going forward too.
And there's another question asking if any of the unions that you work with or the network is thinking about organizing platform-based domestic workers, or if the membership right now has any platform-based domestic workers.
So there is, in fact, even in the study that if you see, you probably saw that we had 47 domestic workers who were working on a platform. So yeah, there is one organization that has started to do it in Pune that we know of. Maybe there are others that I don't,
Hmm.
but yeah, they are there.
I think with that we have covered all the
Most of the
responses
questions.
and questions that people had. Thank you, Marina. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone who joined and stayed with us through this conversation. I hope this
Thank you
discussion
so much.
leaves us with questions to think about around visibility, accountability, and how we want to reimagine the terms of work and value in this sector, and how how can like this time be any different, that when we do suggest a policy or a legislation, it is not stalled or silenced, but it actually is ratified.
Well,
Over to you, Tanvi.
thank you so much. Thank you, Antaran. Thank you, Tanvi, for the
Thanks,
invite.
Marina. This is a really important piece of work, and I'm glad that you could come to IHS online and talk about it. And thanks, Antara, for taking time out to moderate the session. Thank you, everybody who joined us online. A recording will be available on the IHS YouTube channel, so if you missed anything, you can always go back. One last announcement is that Urban 2026, we are hosting it from 15 to 17 January 2026. Applications are still open and closed tomorrow. So if you're interested, please do apply. So thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.